When it comes to powerful Pokemon, you really can't do much better than Mew and Mewtwo. Ever since the start of the franchise, these two have been the pinnacles of power, always being treated with a great amount of respect. So, does this carry over to the Pokemon TCG? Do you see the length of the video? Yeah, so let's not waste any more time here. Join me today as we take a look at the legacy of Mew and Mewtwo in the Pokemon TCG. Both Mewtwo and Mew would immediately make a huge impact on the TCG upon their introduction. Well, okay, technically Mewtwo was first introduced in the original base set, but Mewtwo wouldn't become a true threat until the release of the Mewtwo Black Star promo. Distributed as one of the 4 Pokemon First movie promos, this card would immediately become one of the game's top threats. While this card doesn't seem super impressive on the surface, nearly every aspect of this card allowed it to excel in this era of the game. Being a basic Pokemon in the early formats of the TCG was a huge advantage, being comparable in power to many of the evolution Pokemon, but also being able to attack quicker and often for less energy, which is a big deal in these early formats in particular, due to the prevalence of both energy removal and super energy removal. The ability to deal with these cards can make or break a Pokemon's viability in these formats, with Mewtwo in particular having a very strong countermeasure against these effects, in the form of its attack, Energy Absorption, which for 1 energy allows you to attach 2 energy cards from your discard pile onto Mewtwo. This attack works to both counter energy removal by preloading more energy than you might need onto Mewtwo, but also works great in tandem with your own super energy removal by giving you plenty of extra energy in play to discard with the effect of the card. Energy Absorption also lets you play a bit more recklessly, allowing you to play cards like Professor Oak, Computer Search, or Item Finder much more liberally, since any discarded energy can be brought back into play. The ability to load 2 energies onto Mewtwo also means that Mewtwo can attack even faster than other popular big basic Pokemon, who rely almost solely on energy attachments from the hand, giving Mewtwo a huge advantage on some of the game's most prominent Pokemon, especially Hitmonchan, who Mewtwo could one-shot due to weakness. This card excels in nearly every area of the game. Its ability to play around energy removal and keep pace with the fastest cards in the format makes this one of the best cards in the early days of the TCG. Though it was not invincible. Just like any other card, Mewtwo did have its counters, most notably, Mew. Mew's Psywave would deal 10 damage for each energy attached to the opponent's active Pokemon. With 1+ power, Mew could one-shot a Mewtwo after it's used energy absorption due to weakness, making one of Mewtwo's best attacks also one of its biggest weaknesses. While Mew was helpful against other Pokemon at the time, such as Hitmonchan, it was primarily used as a Mewtwo counter. While being used to counter one singular Pokemon might not seem great, the fact that it's a counter for one of the best cards in the format makes Mew a more than worthy inclusion in almost any deck. Mew and Mewtwo would see a variety of other cards throughout the first and second generation of the TCG, but none of these subsequent cards were able to surpass these two. Mewtwo especially would only get more powerful as newer sets were released. Since energy absorption allows you to accelerate any energy from the discard pile, Mewtwo could take advantage of rainbow energy to power itself up. And since it's being attached from the discard pile rather than your hand, Mewtwo doesn't take any damage from rainbow energy. This synergy makes Mewtwo more consistent as well as more flexible, as it could more easily be paired with Pokemon who have different energy costs. And as Mewtwo becomes a stronger and stronger card, Mew becomes even more desirable as a way to easily take out this massive threat. Though as we enter the Neo era, both of these cards began to wane slightly in playability. With the game's focus on empowering evolution Pokemon, as well as the introduction of Psychic-resistant Sneasel and the completely broken Slowking, Mewtwo, and by extension Mew, became less and less relevant in the game's meta. Though I do want to highlight one deck in particular, this being a Mewtwo-focused tank deck. This deck strategy revolved around using energy absorption to stack special metal energies onto Mewtwo, which for each metal energy attached, the Pokemon they were attached to would take 10 less damage. With special metals reducing damage taken and Goldberry removing damage counters, Mewtwo would become an insanely tanky Pokemon that many Pokemon just couldn't break through. Especially with this deck's combination of energy removal cards and Fossil Muck, whose toxic gas turned off all Pokemon powers, Mewtwo would become an impenetrable fortress who would simply tank damage until your opponent decks themselves out. And thanks to Apom's Pilfer, which would shuffle the card back into your deck, your opponent should almost always deck out before yourself. While this wasn't the most popular deck from this time, it's definitely a very interesting one, as it highlights just how versatile of a card this Mewtwo can be, assuming whatever role it needs to in order to excel in its environment. There's no doubt in my mind that this card is one of Mewtwo's greatest iterations, who alongside Mew is one of the most iconic and powerful cards from this era of the Pokemon TCG. Moving on to Ruby and Sapphire, Mewtwo would take a bit of a backseat this go-around, with both Mewtwo EX and Rocket's Mewtwo being pretty lackluster compared to other EX Pokemon of the time, as well as the likes of Mewtwo Gold Star paling in comparison to some of the other Gold Star Pokemon that were available. Though we would see a useful card released in Delta species, with Delta Mewtwo being a card that's been gaining more traction in the modern years of the format, seeing a decent amount of success in a variety of toolbox-style decks. While Mewtwo can take advantage of its dual fire and steel typing to hit specific Pokemon for weakness, its true value comes in the form of its Delta Switch Pokepower, which lets you move your basic energy attached to your Pokemon however you'd like when Mewtwo is played to the bench. This power would be used in tandem with Latios EX's Fellow Boost, which allows you to attach a basic energy from your hand onto one of your Latios, Latios EX, or Latios EX in play. After getting energy into play with Latios, Mewtwo can move the energy onto whatever Pokemon you need in that specific situation. With this build of the deck in particular, having the ability to hit every relevant weakness in the game. And just like nearly every other deck during this time, this deck would use Holon's cast form to power up its variety of attackers, and with the combination of Latios and Mewtwo, this deck's consistency and flexibility is on par with the other powerful decks in the Ruby and Sapphire to Power Keepers format. But when it comes to the third generation of the TCG, Mew had a far better time with a variety of playable cards, with Mew EX, Mew Gold Star, and Delta Mew all being able to copy the attacks of other Pokemon to varying degrees. Mew EX's versatile lets you use the attacks of any Pokemon in play, both yours and your opponent's. Mew Gold Star's Mimicry lets you copy any of your opponent's Pokemon's attacks, and Delta Mew's Copy lets you use the attacks of your opponent's active Pokemon. While it may seem redundant for all of these cards to exist in one format, these cards do manage to have their own pros and cons, with each one having its own unique property and uses. For instance, while Mew EX seems like the best of the three, since its versatile lets it copy any attack on the board, it also has the downside of being a multi-prize Pokemon unlike the other two. Mew Gold Star seems strictly better than Delta Mew, but it also has the downside of being a Gold Star, meaning you only get one copy of the card in your deck, and you can't play any other Gold Stars, who might be a better fit than Mew depending on the deck. And while Mew EX is a better card in most general situations, Mew Gold Star and Delta Mew can excel against specific targets thanks to their unique fire and water typing, while still being very strong in more than just those specific scenarios. Again, while these cards seem redundant on first glance, each one has their own strengths and weaknesses that must be assessed when choosing which of these cards you want to play in your deck. Since these cards are primarily splashable tech options, they're most often seen as a one-of in a variety of different decks. Though there is one deck that should be highlighted in particular, that being Mewtrick. This iconic deck was piloted by legendary player Jason Klaczynski to a first-place finish at the 2006 World Championships. By using Manectric's Disconnect to lock your opponent out of trainers and Battle Frontier to shut off certain Pokemon's Pokepowers and Pokebodies, you would slowly but surely pick your opponent apart while they were helpless to fight back. Mew EX would make this strategy much more consistent, acting as a buffer between your Manectrics while still being able to use Disconnect. And thanks to cards like Holon's Magneton or Multi-Energy, Mew could easily copy the attacks of any of your opponent's Pokemon, or use the variety of other disruptive attacks this deck had at its disposal. While there are an unlimited number of ways to play these cards, Mewtrick is definitely the most iconic deck featuring Mew from this time in the game's history. Overall, all three of these cards are very powerful, as well as some of the most iconic cards Mew has ever received, with Mew EX in particular going on to get a reprint in the Celebration subset. which in the span of the Pokemon TCG is quite the honor. During Diamond and Pearl, Mew would take a bit of a break, with it only receiving 2 cards. Mew from Secret Wonders can copy the attacks of your opponent's discarded Pokemon, making it somewhat similar to the cards from the previous sets, but unfortunately it never saw anywhere near the same success. And this one... Mewtwo, on the other hand, had a pretty decent showing in the form of Mewtwo Level X. Mewtwo Level X is a very interesting card, primarily due to its Psi Barrier Pokebody, which prevents all effects and damage done to Mewtwo Level X by your opponent's unevolved Pokemon. Now, what's really important about this Pokebody is actually the wording, as it specifies non-evolved Pokemon, which in this era of the game is very important as Level X Pokemon aren't treated as evolutions, but rather as leveled up Pokemon. Meaning, as long as the Pokemon that the Level X levels up from is a basic, Mewtwo is still immune to all damage and effects. This Pokebody allowed Mewtwo to become a backup win condition with the potential to stalemate decks that have no way of hitting through or around Psi Barrier. And with the popularity of the basic-only SP archetype, as well as many other decks focusing solely on basic or level X Pokemon, Mewtwo became a legitimate threat and something that players absolutely had to consider when building their decks. Mewtwo Level X was also a decent attacker in its own right. Giga Burn deals a solid 120 damage with the downside of discarding all energy from Mewtwo, but since Level X Pokemon can use the attacks of the Pokemon they leveled up from, you could use Mewtwo from Majestic Dawn's Energy Absorption, which is identical to its Gen 1 counterpart, to recharge Mewtwo for another attack. Mewtwo Level X also hit for weakness on many popular Pokemon during this time, such as Uxie Level X or Machamp. Like the previous Mew and Mewtwo cards we've seen, Mewtwo Level X was able to be played in a variety of different decks, with a 1-1 Mewtwo line being seen in many high-placing decks at the 2009 World Championships, such as SP Toolbox, Flygon Palkia, Flygon Weavile, and Gengar Dusknoir, just to name a few. While Mew was practically non-existent during this era, Mewtwo more than made up for its slack. Its ability to one-shot many popular Pokemon in the format, and its Pokebody having the potential to secure a game entirely, if not accounted for, makes Mewtwo Level X an extremely powerful card that absolutely demands respect. Following this, Mewtwo would receive 0 cards throughout the entirety of the Heartgold Soulsilver era, though Mew would at least get 1 card, and a pretty good one at that, in the form of Mew Prime. Its Lost Link Pokebody lets you copy the attacks of any Pokemon in the Lost Zone. This would work in tandem with Mew's attack, See Off, which lets you search out any Pokemon from your deck and place it in the Lost Zone. As with most of the previous Mew cards, the ability to use not only yours but any of your opponent's attacks makes this card very flexible throughout the game. Though, admittedly, being restricted to Pokemon in the Lost Zone does hurt this card quite a bit, as unless your opponent is playing a deck that Lost Zones their own Pokemon, you're more or less restricted to just copying your own Pokemon. With that being said, Mew Prime wasn't as common of a card as its Gen 3 counterparts, but it did have its place in the meta. This deck strategy revolves around trainer locking your opponent with Vileplume, while using Yanmega Prime to pick apart your opponent's benched Pokemon, all the while stranding one of your opponent's Pokemon in the active spot and preventing them from fighting back. This is where Mew comes in, as Mew could Lost Zone a variety of Pokemon with disruptive attacks and use them as it sees fit, with the likes of Muck's Sludge Drag to force an opponent's Pokemon into the active spot while also leaving it confused and poisoned, or Spinarak's Spiderweb, which prevents your opponent's active Pokemon from retreating. Mew could also act as a more offensive threat, copying the likes of Jumpluff's Mass Attack, Crobat Prime's Skill Dive, Gengar Prime's Curse Drop, or even Zoroark's Foul Play to more easily copy the attacks of your opponent's Pokemon. With your opponent being locked out of trainer cards and their active Pokemon being poisoned, confused, and unable to retreat, this deck has free reign to tear apart the rest of your opponent's board, with your opponent all but helpless to stop it once the deck gets going. Sadly, however, this deck doesn't have too many accomplishments, as during its time in the game, there were a variety of other more powerful decks, such as Magnabor or Reshiflosion, that absolutely dominated the meta. But a Mew Vileplume deck was taken to a top 8 finish at the 2011 World Championships, in the Seniors Division. In the 2012 season, Mew Prime was seen in another Disruption deck, being a vital component of the Excelgor Chandelure decks at the time. Excelgor's Deck and Cover would deal 50 damage, as well as poison and paralyze your opponent's Pokemon, while forcing you to shuffle Excelgor back into your deck. This attack is insanely strong in tandem with Vileplume, since paralyzed Pokemon can't retreat and the opponent can't play trainers to move or heal their active Pokemon. Their Pokemon would basically be guaranteed to be stuck in the active spot for a turn. With your opponent's Pokemon getting stuck turn after turn after turn, the damage from Deck and Cover, as well as its poison effect, and Chandelure's Cursed Shadow, which lets you place 3 damage counters on your opponent's Pokemon however you like when it's active, would add up very quick. Mew Prime helped this deck operate all but seamlessly, being able to copy Deck and Cover for just 1 double colorless energy, and without having to go through the task of repeatedly evolving into Excelgor. This deck also had access to other great basic attackers like Darkrai EX and Terrakion, who Mew could Lost Zone to then copy, or using Shaman's Celebration Winds, move energy from one Pokemon to another depending on which Pokemon you need at that time. This deck was a double threat, being both an Excelgor lock deck as well as a very flexible attacking deck when the situation called for it, with Mew Prime being the glue that holds all these pieces together. Mew Prime is a very good card. Sure, it's not quite on par with previous or future iterations, but it's still very strong in its own right, with no card at the time, or even today, quite being able to do what it does. Black and White would see Mew and Mewtwo both receiving a single prize card. That's pretty much all there is to say on those, as well as the two of them both receiving an EX card. Let's start with Mew, since it's exactly what you would expect. Mew EX can use the attacks of any Pokemon in play, both yours and your opponent's, thanks to its versatile ability. The exact same ability as Mew EX from Legend Maker. As is the case, this card is mostly used in a very similar manner, as a simple tech inclusion that many decks can take advantage of to instantly boost their decks' versatility. Now, one of the more interesting parts of this card isn't in what it can do, but rather how long it could do it. This card was first released in Black and White's Dragons Exalted in 2012. It then received a reprint in Legendary Treasures in 2013, and finally received another reprint as an XY promo in 2016. And as was the case during this time, every time a card received a reprint, its legality in the standard format would reset, meaning this card was legal starting in 2012 and did not rotate out until 2018. 6 years. This card was legal for 6 years. Surprisingly though, this card didn't overstay its welcome. Since Mew EX was a card that could be used by pretty much any deck and wasn't an oppressive or toxic card in any way, people really didn't mind the card sticking around for that long. While Mew was flexible enough to be used by any deck, each generation had a specific deck that benefited from Mew more than others. In Black and White, Mew EX took the place of Mew Prime, being used in the new iteration of the Excelgor lock deck. This version of the deck still uses Excelgor's Deck and Cover to lock the opponent's Pokemon in the active spot, but now, rather than going into Chandelure, the deck pivots into Gothitelle, whose Magic Room ability stops your opponent from playing items as long as it's in the active spot. This card pretty much serves the same function as Vileplume did. Though Gothitelle does have to be in the active spot rather than anywhere on the field, it also only locks your opponent out of items rather than taking trainers away from both players, so it's a bit of a give and take. While Mew EX is a more widely usable card than Mew Prime, in this deck specifically, Mew EX is actually a bit of a downgrade. Mainly due in the fact that to copy Deck and Cover, Excelgor has to be in play, meaning you actually have to evolve into at least one Excelgor, which is slower and takes up more deck space than the previous iteration. X and Y would see Mew EX used primarily in Night March. With Mew taking the place of another Night Marcher on the board, it allowed the deck to send more of them into the discard pile, thus boosting the attack's damage. And with Sun and Moon, Mew EX was best friends with Zoroark GX, as it was able to copy and one-shot its biggest counter at the time, Buzzwole GX, due to weakness. While these decks especially valued Mew, there were many decks across its 6 years of legality that used the card. Mew EX follows in the footsteps of its predecessor, being a universally good card that wasn't usually the focus of a deck, but was always helpful and a very versatile option that almost any deck could benefit from. Alright, we got a big one to cover here, so let's just get into it. Mewtwo EX from Next Destinies is undoubtedly one of the most infamous, powerful, and impactful cards ever released in the entirety of the game's history. Before we get into the card itself, let's take a look at the state of the game leading up to its release. The current standard lineup featured cards from Heartgold Soulsilver to Noble Victories, with the meta being a healthy blend of both basic and evolution Pokemon. Games during this time were much slower than we see today, thanks to most decks requiring time to evolve their Pokemon, and the fact that most Pokemon during this time only gave up one prize card at a time when knocked out. The only exception being legend cards, which weren't seen too often and had their own restrictions and drawbacks anyway. Though, as black and white sets continued to release, the game was home to more and more big basic Pokemon. These Pokemon, if not balanced properly, had the potential to absolutely dominate the game. However, these Pokemon were all but useless without the aid of other support Pokemon, most of which being evolutions. So, as long as the Pokemon Company continued to balance these big basic Pokemon in a way that they can coexist with evolution Pokemon without destroying the pace of the game, then we should be fine. They, didn't do that. Next Destinies would reintroduce EX Pokemon into the game, and there was no bigger threat at the time than Mewtwo EX. Mewtwo's X-Ball is the card's moneymaker, doing 20 damage for each energy attached to both active Pokemon. Thanks to double colorless energy, this attack could quickly reach huge numbers, and thanks to the attack's energy cost, one double colorless is all Mewtwo needs to start dealing damage. Even if Mewtwo only had one double colorless attached, if the opponent has energy on it too, you could still deal an insane amount of damage. This also made Mewtwo an exceptionally strong revenge attacker, taking knockouts on fully powered up Pokemon with very little investment. Since Mewtwo is a basic Pokemon that really only needs double colorless energy to operate efficiently, this card was extremely splashable, with nearly every deck at the time playing 1 to 2 copies of the card, regardless of the deck's main strategy. This was especially true as Mewtwo EX's best counter was Mewtwo EX, due to it being weak to its own type. Meaning if the opposing Mewtwo has 1 DCE attached, all you need is 3 energy, or a DCE and a plus power, to take a clean 2 prize knockout. This made Mewtwo an even more prevalent card, since the best way to beat it was to use it. While Mewtwo was already strong, it became even stronger with the release of Dark Explorers. More specifically, Darkrai EX. Darkrai EX was another insanely powerful attacker on par with Mewtwo EX, only made even stronger thanks to its Dark Cloak ability, giving all Pokemon with Darkness energy attached a free retreat cost, which was especially helpful in a pre-Floatstone format. These two were often played together in the same deck, but usually operated independently, using one or the other depending on the situation. However, these two played together much better than you would think on first glance. Thanks to Dark Patch accelerating Dark Energy onto Darkrai, and Shaman being able to move energy on your board with its Celebration Winds, you could be attacking with Darkrai 1 minute, and then move all of your Dark Energy onto Mewtwo, attach a double colorless energy on top of that, and Mewtwo is now swinging for massively high numbers. While this was far from the only way to play Mewtwo, it was definitely the most popular, with 13 of the top 32 decks from the 2012 World Championships being Darkrai Mewtwo. Of the other decks from the top 32, 7 of them were also Mewtwo EX variants, being Mewtwo Eels and Mewtwo Celebi, both of which were more of a toolbox-style deck using a variety of different attackers, while giving Mewtwo a bit more priority. While strong, these decks just couldn't compete with the raw power and speed of Mewtwo Darkrai, with the deck comprising all 4 top spots at the event. For a time, Mewtwo EX was on top of the world, with copies of the card fetching insane prices. But if Mewtwo was such an insanely powerful card, why was it seen less and less and less as the game continued to evolve? Well, Mewtwo being as strong as it was definitely a problem for the game. Its ease of inclusion meant there really wasn't a reason for most decks not to play it, especially since it was its own best counter. So not only were players forced to play a specific card in their deck, but the card in question could cost up to $100 at its peak in popularity. This was very unhealthy for the game, but thankfully wouldn't last too long, as by the time of the 2013 World Championships, Mewtwo was completely absent from the top 32 decks. This was mostly achieved by printing even more powerful big basic Pokemon to take Mewtwo's place, bringing far more diversity to the game at the cost of power creeping the game just a little bit, but in terms of the Pokemon TCG, that's really nothing new. While Mewtwo was strong, it was relatively simple in comparison to the newer cards that were being released, with the likes of Keldeo EX or Genesect EX being just as powerful as Mewtwo, while also having much more utility. The true nail in the coffin for Mewtwo, in my eyes at least, was the release of Yveltal EX, whose Evil Ball was the exact same attack as Mewtwo's X-Ball. Yveltal was quite literally just a better Mewtwo, having the same attack while also being able to use Dark Patch to power itself up directly. But it was also a much more balanced card, since its attack required at least one Darkness energy, and obviously wanted to play Dark Patch, it was much more difficult to splash into any deck. And since it wasn't weak to its own typing, there were far more ways to play against it rather than just playing it yourself. Though, that being said, Mewtwo would still see results in the 2014 World Championships. While Yveltal did make up nearly 50% of the top 32 decks, Mewtwo would actually rank higher than all of them, sneaking its way to a third place finish as a part of an Aromatisse Fairy Box deck. Mewtwo also had a decent showing at the 2015 World Championships as well, being included in both second and third place Seismitoad Crobat decks, as well as the first place deck, Archie's Blastoise. In both of these decks, Mewtwo was used as a tech attacker, being used when its psychic typing would give it an advantage, or in situations where you're staring down an opposing Pokemon loaded up with a ton of energy. Mewtwo EX played quite well with both of these decks, either sharing Seismitoad's double colorless energies, or being flooded with water energy by Blastoise's Deluge to swing for huge damage. Overall, Mewtwo EX is one of the most important cards to be released in the modern era of the Pokemon TCG. Its impact on the game cannot be overstated, and was the domino for the beginning of the massive power creep that we still see in the game today. Its speed, power, and flexibility were second to none. Literally the only card that could stand up to it was itself. This card absolutely dominated the game in a way very few others have before or since, and is one of the most important cards in the entirety of the Pokemon TCG.
We'll be back after these messages.
Aw, new Charizard card. Cool.
New Gym Challenge game cards.
Muck, you've got a brand new look.
New cards, new strategies, new trainers. You just can't take your eyes off them.
Yeah.
New Pokemon Gym Challenge cards in stores now. Decks and booster packs sold separately. Playmat not included.
And now back to our show.
X and Y would take some time to introduce new cards for Mew and Mewtwo, probably since both Mew EX and Mewtwo EX were legal well into the XY era. But with the release of Breakthrough, Mewtwo would make its grand return, headlining the set with 2 new EXs and 2 Mega EXs, one for each of its new Mega forms. Mega Mewtwo X EX was definitely the weaker of the two. While its Vanishing Strike can deal up to 200 damage and isn't affected by effects on your opponent's active Pokemon, it was ultimately smothered by the other more powerful and consistent decks of the time. On the other hand, Mega Mewtwo Y EX was a very powerful card. Its Psychic Infinity deals 10 damage plus 30 more damage for each energy on both active Pokemon. This attack is quite literally a more powerful version of X-Ball, but with one massive change. That being that this attack's damage isn't affected by weakness. Since Mega Mewtwo is still weak to its own typing, this drawback prevents the card from being used as its own counter, fixing one of the main issues that plagued the previous Mewtwo EX. Psychic Infinity could reach insanely high numbers very quickly, thanks to double colorless energy still being in the format, as well as having access to Mega Turbo to accelerate energy from the discard pile. While Mega Mewtwo was the star of the show, its base EX was also a very strong part of the deck. Thanks to the Stadium Shrine of Memories, Mega Mewtwo could use the attacks of the Mewtwo it was Mega Evolved from, which in this deck's case was always this one. Shatter Shot deals 30 damage for each psychic energy attached to Mewtwo. While it is just a toned-down version of Psychic Infinity, Shatter Shot does hit for weakness, making it a far better option against Psychic weak opponents. Its other attack, Damage Change, could also come in handy, allowing you to switch the damage counters on Mewtwo with those of your opponent's active Pokemon. This could be used strategically to keep your Mewtwo healthy throughout the game. In terms of partners, Mewtwo was often paired with Garbodor, whose Garbatoxin would shut off all abilities in play as long as it had a tool card attached. Since neither Mewtwo or Mega Mewtwo had abilities, this would hurt your opponent way more than it hurts you. And while these decks did play other Pokemon with abilities, they would typically be used in the opening few turns of the game to get yourself set up, meaning by the time Garbatoxin was online, they were more or less useless anyway. Mega Mewtwo EX was a very strong deck, but unfortunately was never able to see any major success. It placed decently well at some regional events, but aside from those, Mewtwo was relatively unused. While there's a variety of reasons for this, from Mega Pokemon being kinda clunky to play, or the deck taking more time to power up than others, I think the biggest issue that plagues Mewtwo was its weakness to Psychic, which made it even more susceptible to what was at the time the best deck in the standard format. That, of course, being Night March. During the X and Y era, Night March was one of the fastest and hardest hitting decks around, and while it primarily used Joltik as its primary attacker, the deck always had access to Pumpkaboo or Mew EX to hit for Psychic weakness. The deck's aggressive nature and ability to hit for Psychic weakness absolutely ate Mewtwo alive, and with the deck primarily being made up of single prize Pokemon, Mewtwo stood no chance in keeping up with the prize trade. The only hope Mewtwo had would be to target the deck's Shaman or Mew EXs and hope that their deck clunks up just enough to give you time to actually take these knockouts. However, these two prize liabilities would decrease as the X and Y season continued, as with the release of Fates Collide, a new Mew would be released. Now, stop me if this sounds familiar, but Mew's Memories of Dawn allows it to use the attacks of any of your basic Pokemon in play. Yeah, so another Mew that can copy attacks, but as usual, this card was very good. What made it especially good though was that it was a single prizer who could copy the attacks of multi-prize EX Pokemon, while still giving decks a way to hit for Psychic weakness. So not only did this card give every deck a way to destroy Mewtwo, but it was a perfect replacement for Mew EX in Night March, operating identically to its EX counterpart while also helping to maintain the deck's single prize focus. This card was also used a lot in the Sun and Moon era, sneaking its way into standard decks like Buzzwole Lycanroc or Malamar Necrozma, as well as expanded decks from the time, such as Turbo Dark or Mewbox. Like most Mew cards from the past, there are a near infinite amount of ways to play this card. Its addition can instantly boost the flexibility of most decks, and is personally one of my favorite Mew cards to ever be printed. The final card from X and Y to discuss is Mewtwo from Evolutions. No, not Mewtwo EX. Yeah, that one. I'll be honest, I thought this card was completely useless, but in doing research for this video, I was quite surprised, with this card being used as a tech option in the Sun and Moon era. Mewtwo was paired most often with a Zoroark GX as a way of dealing with its most prevalent counter, Buzzwole. Now, to be fair, practically everything was paired with Zoroark GX, but Mewtwo was a constant across most Zoroark variants. Mewtwo's Psychic would deal 20 damage with an additional 20 for each energy on the opponent's active Pokemon. Using this attack, Mewtwo could one-shot a fully powered up Baby Buzzwole, as well as a fully powered up Buzzwole GX if it has a Choice Band attached, all for just a double colorless energy. This card managed to sneak into 4 of the top 32 decks of the 2018 World Championships. I mean, sure, its highest placement was 14th, but that's more than can be said for a lot of other Mewtwo cards. So yeah, this card isn't the craziest thing in the world, but for what it was surprisingly strong, and a pretty successful way to combat one of the game's strongest Pokemon at the time. Sun and Moon released a lot of cards for these two, with a vast majority of them being pretty bad. Some of them were solid, such as Mewtwo GX, who often was seen in Psychic Malamar decks, with its full burst dealing 30 damage for each energy attached to Mewtwo. This attack was a more consistent option when compared to Necrozma or Ultra Necrozma GX, both of which deal more damage but require you to discard energy from them. Mewtwo GX was never a replacement for either of these cards, but rather used in tandem with them as a solid backup attacker who could also hit for Psychic weakness. Mewtwo from Unbroken Bonds was played in a variety of decks thanks to its ability, Mind Report, which lets you place a supporter from your discard pile on top of your deck when played to the bench. This was pretty strong when played in tandem with Oranguru from Sword and Shield, who can use its Primate Wisdom to swap a card from your hand with the top card of your deck, allowing you to grab the supporter that you just placed there with Mind Report. This combination was solid, though would be ultimately replaced by Eldegoss V, who would put a discarded supporter straight into your hand. Unbroken Bonds would also see the release of a new Mew, who miraculously doesn't copy the attacks of other Pokemon. Instead, its Bench Barrier prevents damage done to your benched Pokemon. This ability was especially loved by decks that relied on multiple lower HP Pokemon, such as Malamar or Spiritomb decks, preventing your opponent from taking multiple knockouts. Even decks that relied on larger Tag Team or VMAX Pokemon still loved having Mew on the board, thanks to its ability to block the likes of Pikaram's Tagbolt GX or Urshifu's Gmax Rapid Flow, preventing these attacks from knocking out low HP multi-prize Pokemon on your bench like Dedenne GX or Crobat V. Mew was genuinely a universally good card. Its ability could block or weaken some of the best attacks in the game and allow you to play certain Pokemon without the threat of them being sniped. Even today, this Mew is a staple card in Psychic Gym Leader Challenge decks, and its ability was reprinted in the form of Manaphy from Brilliant Stars, who is a widely played Pokemon in today's current standard format. This card was, and still is, extremely strong. Its simple ability is super powerful, and just might be one of the best support Pokemon cards ever made. Okay, we have another big one here with one of the most powerful Pokemon cards ever printed in the game's long history. Again. That being Mewtwo and Mew Tag Team GX. This card's primary function is in its ability, Perfection, which lets you use the attacks of any of your EX or GX Pokemon in play or in your discard pile. When it comes to what Pokemon were commonly played with Mew Mew, there are a lot, and I do mean a lot. Like, when looking at deck lists, there were something like 50 different Pokemon used across people's decks. So what I'm going to do is talk about these Pokemon in 3 groups, with each group being one of the 3 most popular general Mew Mew archetypes, those being Rainbow, Psychic, and Fire. Starting with Rainbow, this style of deck focused on using a variety of attackers with different energy types, using Rainbow and Aurora energy to allow Mew Mew to use any of these attacks at any point. The most important card to copy here was Solgaleo GX, whose Soul Burst GX lets you search 5 energy from your deck and attach them however you'd like. This attack lets you instantly accelerate your special energy into play, setting you up for most of the game. From here, there are a huge number of different attackers you can use, some of the best being Blastoise GX, whose Rocket Splash lets you shuffle any amount of energy in play back into your deck, dealing 60 damage for each one. Sableye and Tyranitar's Greedy Crush would reward you with a bonus prize card if the attack knocked out a GX or EX Pokemon. Greninja GX's Mist Slash would go through all effects as well as ignoring resistance. Flygon's Desert Hurricane could hit for 240 damage while also discarding stadiums in play. And Marshadow and Machamp would often be used to attack independently without Mew Mew, giving this deck a strong fighting type that could decimate the Dark Box decks that were popular at the time. These are just some of the Pokemon that were used in this style of deck. Obviously, this version of the deck has insane versatility, with the only downside being that the deck runs solely on special energies, which can be an issue in the late game if you're careless with your energy, since there's no way to retrieve special energy from the discard pile. Moving on to the Psychic deck, this one operates using Malamar's Psychic Recharge to accelerate Psychic energy onto Mew Mew from the discard pile. As such, this style of deck focuses on Pokemon with either Psychic or colorless energy costs, including the likes of Trevnoir, who can deal damage while disrupting your opponent's hand with Night Watch, Naganadel, who can snipe 170 damage with its Venom Shot, Incineroar, whose Crushing Punch deals damage while also discarding special energies, and has a very powerful GX attack in the form of Darkest Tornado GX, which deals 10 damage plus an additional 50 damage for each damage counter on the Pokemon. Latios, who deals damage and becomes immune from attacks from Tag Team Pokemon with its Tag Purge, and Espeon Deoxys, whose Psychic Club deals 10 damage plus 30 more for each benched Psychic Pokemon, and its Cross Division GX can spread 10 damage counters, or if it has 3 extra energy on it, spread 20 damage counters however you'd like. While this version of the deck is slightly more limited in what Pokemon and attacks that it can use, it operates much more consistently throughout the game, especially with the energy being accelerated from the discard pile. Though it does rely on getting multiple Malamar into play as quickly as possible, which does somewhat slow the deck down in the early game. Finally, we have the Fire build, which relies on Welder to accelerate fire energy from hand as well as drawing cards. As such, this deck focuses on fire Pokemon as well as Pokemon with colorless energy costs. With Reshiram and Charizard, whose Flare Strike can deal 230 damage, Charizard, whose Flare Blitz GX just does 300 damage, and Magcargo, whose Lava Flow deals 50 damage, plus 50 more for each basic energy card that you discard from it. This deck, similarly to the Psychic version, also plays Pokemon with colorless energy costs, such as Mega Lopunny Jigglypuff, whose Jumping Balloon does 60 damage, plus 60 more for each of your opponent's GX or EX Pokemon in play, or the Promo Solgaleo, whose Turbo Strike can deal damage and accelerate 2 basic energies from the discard pile onto one of your benched Pokemon. This version of the deck takes advantage of the plethora of great fire support in the format, like Welder, Fire Crystal, or Giant Hearth, to power up its threats. The biggest downside in doing this, though, is that it lacks an onboard energy option. And since Welder, as well as the energy it accelerates, has to be in your hand, this deck was far more vulnerable to hand disruption than the others. The Pokemon that I listed for these 3 variants are nowhere near all of the Pokemon that were played. I also want to say that just because I mentioned a Pokemon in one section doesn't mean it wasn't played in the others. For instance, Incineroar and Mega Lopunny and Jigglypuff are often played in both the Fire and Psychic variants, and the Rainbow version can quite literally play any Pokemon used in both Psychic or Fire variants. But I think this shows just how insanely versatile of a card Mewtwo and Mew really is. With so many different attacks and effects at its disposal, this card can quite literally do it all. So, it should come as no surprise that Mewtwo and Mew took first place at the 2019 World Championships. This build, piloted by one Henry Brand, operated using the Welder engine along with a plethora of different attackers, some of which I didn't even mention here. In terms of support Pokemon, there is also a variety of different options, namely Dedenne GX, who both draws cards and discards Pokemon to use for perfection, Jirachi GX to turn off Mew Mew's weakness, and Marshadow, who could bump stadiums with its resetting hole. As Mew Mew was especially weak to the stadium card Power Plant, which turns off all GX and EX Pokemon's abilities, which obviously turns off Mew Mew's perfection, which pretty much shuts down the whole deck. Before we move on, I also want to briefly highlight this card's performance in the expanded format, where this card was even more broken. Don't forget, Perfection can copy the attacks of EX Pokemon as well as GX Pokemon. This gives Mew Mew access to even more broken attackers, stretching all the way back to Next Destinies. Some of the best ones were Mega Gengar EX, whose Phantom Gate would let you use the attack of any of your opponent's Pokemon. Jolteon EX's Flash Ray deals 70 damage and makes the Pokemon immune from attacks from basic Pokemon. And Mewtwo EX, whose damage change can be used much better by Mew Mew thanks to its larger health pool. Mew Mew can also use GX Pokemon who had rotated by the time it entered the standard format, such as Noivern GX, who could both item lock and special energy lock your opponent, or Espeon GX, whose Psychic deals 60 damage plus 30 more for each energy on your opponent's active. Combine all this with Battle Compressor, Dimension Valley, and Computer Search, Mew Mew becomes an absurdly powerful deck, even more versatile than it was in Standard, which is saying a lot. Overall, Mewtwo and Mew Tag Team GX is an absurdly strong card. Its flexibility is truly second to none, and is by far one of the most powerful cards ever printed in the entire history of the Pokemon TCG. Man, I've said that like 5 times already. Sword and Shield would calm things down quite a bit, but that's not to say there weren't any playable cards released. Quite the opposite, actually. For instance, we have Mewtwo v Union, who was the centerpiece of a control-style deck. Mewtwo v Union is an incredibly tanky Pokemon, with 310 HP, an immunity to all effects of attacks with its Photon Barrier, and its Super Regeneration allowing it to heal 200 damage from itself. It was extremely difficult for your opponent to knock it out even once during a game, especially when they're being assaulted with the deck's variety of disruption cards, like Crushing Hammer, Flannery, and most notably, Yveltal from Celebrations, whose Cry of Destruction would discard 3 special energy from your opponent's Pokemon. This attack could be used for a single attachment thanks to Twin Energy, and was especially brutal on decks that entirely relied on special energies. This version of the deck also relied heavily on Snorlax, whose Gourmandize would fill your hand to 7 cards if it was active, but would then end your turn to continuously keep a full hand, and as such, have access to as many disruptive tools as you could at any point. Add in Radiant Gardevoir and V-Guard Energy to reduce the amount of damage Mewtwo takes from opposing Pokemon V, and you can almost guarantee your opponent will run out of resources before Mewtwo even comes close to being knocked out. However, because of the rotation of the early Sword and Shield sets in 2023, Mewtwo V-Union was forced to adapt. And adapt it did. Even before rotation, Mewtwo V-Union saw some success utilizing Kirlia from Silver Tempest as an alternate draw engine from Snorlax, who could also evolve into Gardevoir from Chilling Reign, who could accelerate energy onto Mewtwo as well as draw you cards. But it wasn't until Scarlet and Violet where this version of the deck would become truly powerful, in part because Snorlax was gone, but more so because of the release of Gardevoir EX, who evolves from the same Kirlias the deck already saw success with, and could continuously accelerate Psychic Energy onto Mewtwo with its Psychic Embrace ability. And the fact that the ability places damage counters on the recipient of the energy didn't really matter when Mewtwo was healing 200 damage turn after turn. This version of the deck was a little more offense-oriented, opting not to play Yveltal or Hammers, but rather using Zacian V or Mewtwo itself to take knockouts. Mewtwo V-Union, while primarily a defensive Pokemon, was also an extremely strong attacker, able to either play 16 damage counters with Psysplosion, or do a raw 300 damage with Final Burn. Both of these attacks are great at either taking multiple knockouts, or blowing through larger V-Star and EX Pokemon in the format. The biggest downside of Mewtwo V-Union, however, is, well, the fact that it's a V-Union. V-Union Pokemon were just really weird. They only made like 5 of them, and Mewtwo was the only one that was actually playable. Actually getting these Pokemon into play was kind of a pain, requiring all 4 pieces to be in the discard pile, from which you can then summon it into play. This sounds annoying, and it was, but it wasn't that bad as long as the deck was built properly, and, you know, hey, at least if the V-Union gets knocked out and goes to the discard pile, you can just resummon it, right? No. V-Union Pokemon can only be summoned from the discard pile once a game, so if it gets knocked out, it's gone for good. This major downside is partially why Mewtwo was one of the only ones that was able to achieve any kind of success, as it was the only one who could actually sustain itself throughout a game. Its Photon Barrier actually played a massive role in its viability in the pre-rotation format, as the undisputed best deck in the game at that time was Lugia V-Star, who always played amazing Yveltal, whose amazing destruction instantly knocked out the defending Pokemon. Mewtwo's ability left it completely unaffected by the attack, while the other V-Unions had no such defense, going down for good from a single attack and giving up 3 prize cards in the process. Despite the odds, Mewtwo V-Union was a surprisingly strong stall/control card, able to shut out some of the strongest and most aggressive decks in the format. Though it never made it to the World Championships, it did manage to claim a first place win at a regional event twice, both pre and post rotation, which for a V-Union ain't too shabby at all. The Celebrations expansion would bring a couple of cards for both Mew and Mewtwo, though they are just reprints of cards from previous sets and aren't standard legal. It's still cool to see dominant cards from old formats given the respect they deserve here in the modern day. Though the main set of Celebrations would also deliver a new Mew. This card's Mysterious Tail ability lets you look at the top 6 cards in your deck and take an item card that you find there while Mew is in the active spot. This ability is pretty solid. Its effect is very general and can benefit almost any deck it's played in. Mew was most commonly seen in both Charizard EX and Gardevoir EX decks, used to find important trainer cards like Battle VIP Pass or Rare Candy to get your Pokemon into play as quickly and consistently as possible. This card was typically seen in very low counts, with most decks opting to play only a single copy. Though one deck that did play this card in a heavier count was Vikavolt Item Lock. This deck's goal was to use Vikavolt V's Paralyzing Bolt to item lock your opponent as early as possible. By playing multiple Mews, as well as a full count of Scoop Up Nets, this deck would be able to find the pieces it needed to charge Vikavolt as early as turn 1. Oftentimes, the deck would be able to item lock the opponent throughout the whole game, while simultaneously taking knockouts as the damage from Paralyzing Bolt adds up. Similarly to Mewtwo v Union, this deck didn't quite make it to Worlds, but was seen in decent amounts at various regional events, even taking first place at the San Diego and Stuttgart regional championships. One trait shared by both decks was their full 4 counts of Mew, who absolutely made the decks what they were. While Celebrations wasn't a very playable set at all, Mew was one of the few cards to emerge as something more than a bulk holo, easily being one of, if not the, best card to come out of Celebrations. Which I know isn't really saying much, but just let them have it. If you've been playing the standard format at all in the past 3 years, then this deck really needs no explanation. But for the rest of you, Mew VMAX has been an extremely strong archetype since the day it was introduced in Fusion Strike. The deck focuses around 2 Pokemon in particular, Mew VMAX and Genesect V. Mew VMAX is the primary attacker, using its Cross Fusion Strike to copy the attacks of your Fusion Strike Pokemon on your bench. In this deck's case, you most commonly copy Genesect V's Technoblast, which deals 210 damage, but prevents you from attacking the following turn. This downside is practically non-existent, however, thanks to Mew's free retreat, allowing it to pivot into another Mew or be switched back into the active, with the negative effect now removed. Genesect V, however, might actually be the more important piece of the deck. Aside from giving Mew an attack to copy, it's also the deck's draw engine. Fusion Strike system lets you fill your hand up to the number of Fusion Strike Pokemon you have in play. Since this deck only plays Fusion Strike Pokemon, Genesect often lets you fill your hand to 6 cards. What makes this ability so powerful, however, is that it can be used once per turn per Genesect, which means you could, and often would, fill your hand to 6 cards up to 4 times in a single turn, allowing you to tear through your deck extremely fast. Since your on-board draw engine is so strong, this deck plays far less draw supporters than most other decks, usually focusing on cards that disrupt the opponent in some way, like Judge or Avery. Another common supporter is Elisa's Sparkle, which lets you search your deck for 2 Fusion Strike energies and attach them to 2 of your Fusion Strike Pokemon. Elisa, as well as Fusion Strike energy, is often played in builds alongside Meloetta, whose Melodious Echo does 70 damage for each Fusion Strike energy you have in play. This would deal a maximum of 280 damage, which is insane for a basic single prize Pokemon. This fusion build of Mew would also play double turbo energies to charge Mew's Cross Fusion Strike in a single attachment, who could then copy Meloetta's attack without the risk of losing any of the Fusion Strike energy in play. Another option this build sometimes used was Ice-Q, whose Block Slider deals 40 damage to any of your opponent's Pokemon for each of your Fusion energy in play, allowing you to snipe lower HP targets sitting on your opponent's bench. The other Mew variants relied solely on double turbo energy, forgoing Elisa's and Fusion Strike energy entirely. These builds, however, tended to play a much higher count of the Stadium Path to the Peak, which would shut down the abilities of all Rulebox Pokemon in play. While it may seem counterintuitive to play Path to the Peak when the deck is so reliant on Genesect to draw cards, it's actually not as harsh as you would think. Once your board is established, it's pretty self-sufficient, with Mew only needing a single double turbo to attack. Plus, you really only play Path to the Peak when you're already in an advantageous position, or at least a position where it would hurt your opponent more than it would hurt you. Plus, if there's a card you really, absolutely need and you have no way of bumping Path, this deck plays 3 to 4 Forest Sealstone, which can be played when under Path to the Peak, since Star Alchemy is the ability of the tool card and not the ability of the Pokemon the tool is attached to. This loophole pretty much guarantees you any one card that you need at any point in the game for basically nothing. While it is true that this version of the deck lacks the massive damage output of Meloetta, it can still hit for higher numbers than you might think. Thanks to Power Tablet boosting the damage of your Fusion Strike Pokemon by 30 on the turn that it's played, and Choice Belt boosting the damage done to Pokemon V by 30, Genesect's Technoblast is capable of hitting upwards of 360 damage, easily knocking out any Pokemon in the format. Mew VMAX is one of the most powerful and dominant decks we've seen in the modern era of the Pokemon TCG. For a while, the Pokemon Company was seemingly printing cards made specifically to counter Mew and Mew alone, Such as in Astral Radiance, they printed Mightyena, who was a dark type that could hit Mew for weakness, and made its attack just strong enough to one-shot Mew because of it, as well as giving it an ability that lets it attack for free when facing a Mew VMAX deck. Then, when that didn't do anything, they released Drapion V in Lost Origin, who was a dark type that could hit Mew for weakness, and made its attack just strong enough to one-shot Mew because of it, as well as giving it an ability that lets it attack for free when facing a Mew VMAX deck. When that didn't work, they printed Klefki in Scarlet and Violet, who would shut off all basic Pokemon's abilities, including Fusion Strike System, when it was active. Then when that didn't work, they printed Spiritomb in Paldea Evolved, who would turn off all basic Pokemon V's abilities, including Fusion Strike System, when it was in play. All 4 of these cards, when announced, were blown out of proportion and hailed as the key to killing and ending Mew VMAX. And all 4 of them failed to keep Mew completely in check. Drapion was definitely the most effective, but even with all 4 of these Pokemon legal in the format, Mew VMAX proceeds to claim first place at the 2023 World Championships, as well as having many other high placements throughout the entire tournament. While, yes, Klefki and Spiritomb do have uses against many other decks, I don't think there has been a card more obviously made to counter one and only one deck than Drapion V. Even with all of these roadblocks in its path, Mew VMAX was an absolute monster. Its damage, draw power, and consistency is some of the best we've seen out of any deck in the game, period. Honestly, from here out, it's mostly downhill. Mewtwo from Crown Zenith does see play in some Psychic-type Gym Leader Challenge decks as a powerful attacker in the mid to late game, but as far as Standard goes, not so much. Same goes for Mewtwo V-Star and Mewtwo EX, both of which aren't the worst cards ever, but they just don't really have a place in the current format of the game. However, we do leave off on a good note here with Mew EX from 151. It can draw you cards with its Restart ability, filling your hand to 3 cards. It has Free Retreat, acting as a pivot, which helps certain decks immensely. And of course, its attack, Genome Hacking, lets you use the attacks of your opponent's active Pokemon. As with most Mew cards, this card is played in a ton of different decks. From Roaring Moon and Miraidon to Gardevoir and Lost Box, this card has its fingers in a bunch of different pies. And as the game continues and new sets release, we'll just have to wait and see what deck Mew calls home next. Both Mew and Mewtwo's legacies are ones that are very hard to live up to. Starting in the game's earliest formats, these 2 Pokemon's strength was established right away, with that strength only growing as time went on. I find it very interesting to see how a card's identity is formed as the game evolves. For instance, Mew wasn't able to copy attacks until Ruby and Sapphire, but from that point on, nearly every Mew card released afterwards had some manner of using another Pokemon's attacks as its own. It's also interesting to see how these cards, whether intentionally or not, convey the difference in Mew and Mewtwo's character, with Mewtwo typically being a powerful threat capable of toppling any opponent that usually requires little to no direct support to operate efficiently, while Mew is often in a more supportive role, still being strong and able to take knockouts, but always with the help of others. I'm definitely looking too much into it, but I think it's cool to think about regardless. What I can say for certain though, is that Mew and Mewtwo are some of the most accomplished Pokemon in the game, with their status as Tier 1 threats remaining true across the game's 25-year history. I'm confident when I say that Mew and Mewtwo are 2 of the most powerful, versatile, and infamous Pokemon in the entire history of the Pokemon TCG.